The Vadran believed themselves eternal, their fleets carved from metals that never corroded, their machines guided by minds older than the histories of most civilizations. They had crushed empires, erased cultures, and rewritten the fate of entire galaxies. But when they came to Halcyon 9, they did not find another empire to dismantle. They found humanity, raw and stubborn, clinging to survival with hands cut and bloodied, refusing to kneel even when every logical outcome promised annihilation. The first waves of alien war machines descended in perfect formation, their black wings blotting out the stars, their weapons bending the laws of physics to tear through energy shields and digital defenses. The alien settlers on Halcyon 9 fell in days, their technology corrupted by viral codes that unraveled entire planetary networks. Yet in the ruins, where others surrendered, humans improvised. They lit fires to signal across valleys when comms fell. They dug trenches by hand when shields collapsed. They stripped vehicles down to their bones and rebuilt them into weapons that coughed smoke and fire, but kept moving forward. At first, the Vadran did not understand what they were seeing. Their algorithms predicted all possible outcomes, but they had not accounted for a species so unrefined that even defeat could be reshaped into resistance. The nanite storms that ate through machines were countered not with sophisticated programs, but with barrels of corrosive acid rolled down hills, smothering swarms in clouds of vapor. The gravity lances that pinned armor columns were thwarted by soldiers crawling through mud, dragging themselves inch by inch to plant explosives by hand. What should have been a swift conquest turned into a war of attrition, one the Vadran could not process. Their enemies were supposed to collapse when the equation demanded it, but humans rewrote the equation with each passing day. When the siege engine landed on Halcyon 9, a walking fortress whose shields could withstand bombardments equal to the wrath of suns, the settlers despaired. But Elias Ward, a man with grease under his fingernails and stubbornness etched into his bones, saw the fortress not as unstoppable but as vulnerable. He understood that no system was perfect, that even a shield had cycles, that endless pressure could break the strongest wall. He gathered his people not with speeches, but with the blunt clarity of a mechanic explaining a fix. They scavenged every scrap of metal from abandoned towns, every twisted beam, every broken hull. Using makeshift launchers and rail slings, they hurled this mountain of junk against the alien shield. For hours the sky rained steel, appliances, gutted machines, even rocks wrapped in copper wire. The Vadran mocked their desperation until the shield flickered, shuddered, and then failed. The humans did not hesitate. They charged, swarming the fortress like ants over a wounded beast, drilling, burning, flooding its innards until smoke rose in defiance against the empire that had never been beaten. The fall of the siege engine rippled through the stars. Alien eyes across the galaxy turned to reports, disbelief spreading like wildfire. A minor species, armed with nothing but scraps and willpower, had brought down the jewel of the Vadran war machine. The Empire doubled its fury, deploying fleets, unleashing horrors crafted in their darkest forges. Yet each new weapon found itself undone by something that should not have worked. Messenger birds carried instructions through smoke when jammers filled the air. Farmers turned irrigation tunnels into escape routes. Children drew maps of patrol paths from memory, smuggling them to resistance fighters. Humanity was not winning because they were stronger, but because they were impossible to predict. Every weakness became a weapon, every mistake a chance to learn, every loss a reason to adapt. The Vadran began to fear the very chaos they had once dismissed. Their machines were flawless, their strategies efficient, but perfection became their weakness. They could not bend. Humans bent with every blow, reshaping themselves, reimagining survival until survival became victory. Slowly, against every expectation, the tide shifted. Worlds that had lived under Vadran chains began to whisper the same word, human. It spread in quiet reverence, in stories of impossible battles and desperate brilliance, in legends of fragile beings who refused to break. And in the heart of it all was the truth the galaxy would never forget, that when alien technology failed, when logic and certainty crumbled, human ingenuity endured. The defeat of the siege engine marked more than a battle won. It became a spark that spread far beyond Halcyon 9. Alien refugees who had once dismissed humans as reckless now looked at them with awe. Their stories carried across trade routes and whispered in the dark corners of occupied worlds. For the first time in centuries, the Vadran war machine faltered, not in firepower, but in fear. They were unaccustomed to uncertainty, and humanity embodied it. What unsettled them most was that humans did not fight for conquest or expansion. They fought because they had nowhere else to go, because surrender was not in their nature, because stubborn defiance burned hotter than the weapons they carried. When the Vadran escalated their campaign, deploying fleets bristling with planet crackers and swarms of drone legions, humanity once again refused to meet them on familiar ground. They knew their starships could not win in the void, so they turned space into a trap. Elias Ward and his engineers studied the Vadran fleet patterns, and instead of building bigger weapons, they seeded the asteroid belts with mines crafted from repurposed engines and volatile chemicals. The mines were disguised as nothing more than broken rock, scattered by human hands over weeks of quiet labor. When the fleet entered the belt, thousands of tiny explosions ignited in chaotic succession, tearing through drones and crippling capital ships. The Vadran could adapt to calculated strikes, but not to detonations triggered by random tumbling debris, set off by tripwires no sensor could predict. The galaxy watched as human improvisation bled a titan, and the more they resisted, the more other species began to stir. On worlds where rebellion had long been extinguished, people rose again, inspired by stories of humans throwing rocks at star gods and winning. Small bands of insurgents reached out across hidden networks, sending desperate pleas to Halcyon 9. Humanity answered, not with fleets, but with ideas. Manuals were written in grease-stained notebooks, diagrams of traps and sabotage drawn with shaking hands, smuggled through back channels and encoded in children's songs. In time, these became the Ward Protocols, a patchwork guide to defeating the undefeatable, rooted not in technology, but in creativity. The Vadran tried to stamp it out. They unleashed new machines designed to adapt, weapons that rewrote their programming on the battlefield. Yet even then, humans found cracks to exploit. When faced with adaptive drones, they used decoys, crude mannequins that bled heat signatures, luring machines into ambushes. When the Vadran unleashed atmosphere burners, humans filled the skies with reflective dust from detonated silos, scattering targeting systems into confusion. Each countermeasure was not elegant, not clean, but effective. What unnerved the Vadran most was that humans seemed to thrive on being cornered. Pressure made them sharper, fear made them bolder, and loss made them angrier. The harder the Empire pressed, the stronger their defiance grew. Elias Ward himself became more than a commander. To humans, he was a leader, but to other species, he became a myth. The man who tore down a fortress with junk, who turned miners into warriors, who stood before the machines of gods and said no. His image spread across the stars, sometimes painted on walls, sometimes etched into scrap metal, a symbol of resistance. Even in systems humanity had never touched, rebels began to carve the word human onto their weapons, believing it gave them strength. The Vadran High Command convened in secrecy, their voices sharp with unease. Never had a species so small inflicted such lasting damage. Their generals demanded extermination, but others whispered caution. For every world they burned, 3 more whispered rebellion. For every machine they sent, humans found a way to break it. The Empire was learning too late that technology, no matter how advanced, was brittle when wielded against those who refused to fight by the rules. On Halcyon 9, humans gathered in underground cities carved into stone, planning not for survival but for the next strike. Ward stood among them, maps spread across makeshift tables, his hands scarred from a dozen near-deaths, his eyes bright with something the Vadran could not understand. Hope. He spoke not of vengeance, but of outsmarting giants, of turning weakness into advantage, of building a future with their own hands. The room filled with tired faces, soldiers and civilians alike, and in their silence was a shared truth. They were no longer fighting to survive a war. They were fighting to prove that ingenuity mattered more than power. And in that moment, humanity began to become something greater than itself, a legend. The rebellion spread like cracks in glass, invisible at first, then unstoppable once the fracture lines connected. What began on Halcyon 9 with scavenged weapons and desperate measures evolved into a movement that reached across dozens of star systems. Small bands of alien rebels carried human methods into their own struggles, adapting them with local knowledge. always guided by the lesson that nothing was invincible if you were clever enough to find its weakness. A mining clan on the frozen world of Zareth. For toppled a Vader and Walker by collapsing an ice ridge with explosives made from stolen fuel. On Calvus Prime, farmers redirected irrigation channels to flood drone hangars, shorting out thousands of machines in minutes. And on the shattered moon of Tyrix, refugees armed with tools and sharpened scrap metal ambush patrols. Inspired by stories of humans who once did the same, everywhere the resistance took hold, humanity's name was invoked. At first, it was whispered like a prayer. If the humans can, so can we. Soon, it became a rallying cry shouted before battles. Fight like humans. The Vaderan found themselves battling not just an enemy, but an idea, and ideas could not be destroyed with weapons. The Empire responded with brutality. They unleashed extermination fleets, reducing entire cities to molten wastelands. They deployed overseers, colossal AI construct designed to predict insurgent behavior, and cut rebellions off before they could take root. Yet the overseers, brilliant though they were, struggled against the one thing they could not quantify: human unpredictability. When logic said an army should retreat, humans attacked. When data suggested they would strike at supply lines, they instead planted decoys and hit command nodes. They built decoys of decoys, traps within traps, layers of deception that left overseers chasing ghosts while real resistance flourished in shadows. Elias Ward became the unifying figure of this growing chaos. Though still rooted on Halcyon 9, his voice traveled through hidden channels, through coded broadcasts that leapt from planet to planet like sparks on dry wood. He did not speak of glory nor of conquest. His speeches were plain, almost conversational, but they struck deeper than any battle hymn. The Vaderan think they know how we'll act. They think they understand the rules. But we're not here to play by their rules. We're here to break them. Every one of you has something they don't expect. Use it. These words became scripture. Rebels stopped fearing their lack of weapons, seeing instead endless opportunities in what they did have. On one world, children used slings to shatter the optics of drone scouts, blinding entire formations. On another, engineers turned musical instruments into coded communication devices that the overseers dismissed as harmless noise. The galaxy was turning human, not in biology, but in mindset. The Vaderan High Council, for the first time in centuries, argued not over expansion, but over survival. Their empire was too vast to collapse overnight, but their aura of inevitability had shattered. The machines that had cowed generations were now mocked as predictable, their precision seen as weakness rather than strength. The more they tried to stamp out resistance, the more it spread, because every act of cruelty only proved the humans right. That power without adaptability was doomed to fail. On Halcyon 9, humanity prepared for the inevitable counterstrike. Ward knew the Vaderan would not rest until they made an example of the world that had humiliated them. The people tunneled deeper, stockpiled everything from stolen weapons to homemade bombs. But what they relied on most was not firepower. It was creativity. Every trap was unique. Every tactic designed to confuse and overwhelm. The city ruins became a labyrinth of ambush points. The forest seeded with false signals. The rivers rigged to flood at a moment's notice. It was not a fortress of walls, but of ideas. When the Vaderan Armada finally descended, it came not as a surgical strike, but as an act of vengeance. Their ships blotted out the stars, their weapons saturating the land with fire. Yet even as Halcyon 9 burned, the resistance did not break. Humans and their allies moved like ghosts through the chaos, striking not at the strongest points, but the seams. Communications relays, power couplings, the fragile links that even the greatest machines depended on. It was not one decisive blow that turned the tide, but 1,000 small ones, each one carried out by hands too stubborn to surrender. And when the dust settled, Halcyon 9 still stood, not whole, not unscarred, but alive. The Vaderan had bled resources and pride into the ground, and in their retreat, the galaxy learned the truth. Even the greatest empire could be humbled by a people who refused to give up. Humanity had proven that technology alone was not power. Ingenuity was. Word of Halcyon 9's survival traveled faster than the Vaderan ships could chase it. Across occupied worlds, the impossible became a possibility. Entire generations had grown up believing the Empire to be eternal. their machines unbeatable, their power unquestionable. Now that illusion lay cracked. Refugees and rebels whispered of humans who had beaten the siege engine with junk, who had blinded fleets with asteroids, who had fought not with strength but with imagination. And everywhere, those whispers turned into action. On the swamp world of Drelf, a species long enslaved rose up, sabotaging the legs of Vadran walkers with simple wooden stakes coated in resin that corroded alloys. On Orvani Prime, exiled scholars built libraries of resistance tactics, every human improvisation carefully documented and adapted to local conditions. They taught that rebellion was not about matching firepower, but about seeing what others overlooked. The phrase "fight like humans" became universal, passed from tongue to tongue in 1,000 dialects. The Vadran fought back with escalating cruelty. Cities were glassed, populations executed en masse, entire biomes poisoned to starve rebels. Yet each atrocity only birthed more resistance. The overseers, once feared as gods of strategy, found themselves overwhelmed not by armies, but by chaos. They could calculate fleet movements and supply chains, but they could not predict a child with a slingshot taking out a drone or a farmer collapsing a grain silo onto patrols. Their perfection had no answer for imperfection weaponized. Elias Ward, though weary and scarred, became the symbol of this new age. His voice carried through pirated frequencies and smuggled recordings, sometimes no more than a few words scratched onto paper, but always enough to ignite hope. To his own people he was a commander, but to the galaxy he was becoming a legend. Entire alien cultures began painting his likeness on walls, sometimes as a man, sometimes as a faceless figure of defiance, always with the same message: if he could fight, so could they. The tipping point came when a coalition of rebel worlds, bound not by treaties but by desperation, gathered in secret. Representatives of dozens of species sat in a cavern lit by jury-rigged lamps, the air thick with distrust. Old rivalries simmered, each group wary of betrayal. Then the humans entered. Only a handful, their clothes patched, their weapons old, their leader nothing more than an aging engineer-turned-soldier. Elias Ward did not give a grand speech. He spoke plainly, his voice steady. We don't have fleets. We don't have weapons to match theirs, but we have what they'll never understand. We adapt. We think sideways. And we never stop. Alone we survive. Together we win. The chamber fell silent. Then, one by one, the others nodded. Not because humanity promised victory, but because humanity promised possibility. That night, the first true alliance against the Vadran in centuries was born, not of equals, but species united under the banner of an idea, that ingenuity could topple power. The Vadran did not see the shift until it was too late. At first, they thought they were still fighting scattered insurgencies, but soon patterns emerged. Fleets that had once operated independently began coordinating strikes. Sabotage across star systems occurred in perfect sequence. Supply lines vanished overnight. Worlds thought secure erupted in rebellion. And at the heart of every victory, somewhere in the shadows, there was always a trace of humanity, an improvised weapon, a strategy born from scrap, a spark of reckless brilliance. By the time the Vadran realized this was no longer a war of suppression, but a war for survival, their enemies had grown too numerous, too unpredictable, too human.